II is completely different from these wars. The whole country was involved in World War II. On the home front, it was very, very aware that it was wartime on the home front.
And if you worked in the orchards, you went through boots real quick, and you had to get special permits to buy boots to wear. And you didn't have any leather shoes. The shoes were made out of gabardine, or I don't know whether you know what that is or not, but it's a cloth. And they had the soles, leather soles, but the shoes were not leather. You made a lot of your dresses. Women made their own dresses. Some people made their own suits. Well, food was rationed, and you had to stand in line to get groceries, and you had to have special stamps for meat and coffee. And let's see, my grandpa, he drank lots of coffee, and we didn't drink much, so we'd trade him coffee stamps for his meat stamps. And if you ran out of meat stamps, you either eat bologna or or beans. And we had a lot of beans. You just had to have stamps to buy most of all those things. And you stand in line. If you were familiar with the grocery store, you went in there regularly, they would save back maybe bananas for you or something. They'd say, oh, I've got some bananas stuck back for you. And you were real glad to get them because you couldn't hardly buy bananas. Anything like that. Of course, we had peaches and things from off the trees out there, and cherries, apples, and this meat was the most, what we really missed the most.
We didn't have any butter. For butter, we used some white, fatty stuff that looked terrible, and then they'd give us coloring, and we could color the white, fatty stuff for butter. There was very little meat, there was very little gasoline. People were rationed on the gasoline.
And you had to have gas stamps in order to buy gas for your car, and you had to get special permits from the state board they had, and you had to get special permits to even buy tires for your car.
So people never went to their beautiful homes down in Florida during the winter. The homes down there were all boarded up. All the streets and buildings were boarded up. Where the whole country was at war, and you could realize it in every way. And women were called upon to help from the very beginning. The women helped on the home front and on the war front. There were the people that were called the Rosie the Riveters. Hundreds and thousands of young women went to California where they made airplanes, and they were civilians, but they worked 6 days a week. Nobody thought of having a weekend off. To get 1 day off a week was fabulous during wartime. Some people worked 7 days a week, 24 hours. People worked all the time. Everyone was doing something about the war. There wasn't one family that was not involved some way in the war. And there was a draft. That made all the difference in the world. The young men from all walks of life, even from college, were called out to go to war. So all young people were at war. The only way they got out of going to war was a medical reason, and flat feet was one of them. Young man had flat feet, he did not go to war. And a popular song started about the flat-foot floozies, a song about the flat-foot floozy. And they finally found a way to even use the men with flat feet. They had them work at desk jobs and do kinds of work where they didn't have to walk. But everybody was involved in the war, from the top to the bottom. And they eventually brought the women into the military services. The women who went into the Army were called WACs. Those in the Navy, of course, were called WAVs. Those in the Marine Corps were just called Women Marines. And those in the Coast Guard were called SPAs. There were hundreds and thousands of women in uniform. They were quite different from the women in uniform today. The women in uniform today are on the battlefront. they carry weapons. In my day, no woman could carry a weapon, and no women were sent to the battlefront. Our job was to replace a man for battle. And I joined first the Coast Guard, and I had a job immediately replacing a man for battle. Every week he'd send a letter requesting sea duty, but they couldn't send him to sea duty because he was a good typist, and they kept him in an office typing. But I replaced him for duty, so he went off to sea duty. And that happened with all the women in service. Their job was to replace the men, to do their jobs that they were doing in the States, so that the men could go off to fight. Now my husband can tell more about the fighting because he was in the fighting, but we were all aware every day of what was going on the battlefront. It was very close to us. We all had friends or family in the battlefront. Also, England was very much at risk because the plan of the Nazis was to take France and Belgium and to have a seafront from which they could invade England. That was their plan. And they bombed England continually. The British people had their cities on fire nearly every night. And we in the States were always sending care packages, not only to our military people, but to the people in Great Britain, because the only ones left there were the women and the very old men. The old men at night worked on the roofs, putting off the fires, because the bombs that were dropped would start fires, and they'd keep buckets of water on the roofs of all the major buildings. And the old men and the young women were on the roofs putting out the fires. And all the rest of the population was down underground. They'd go in the subways at night. For years, they never got to sleep in their own beds. They had to sleep underground because the bombs, as far as I know, they never did break through the subways and kill the people who were huddled in the subways. The children were in the subways, except they later sent a lot of them to Canada and to the United States. But they were afraid to send them on the ships because the ships got bombarded by the submarines. For a long time, the German submarines just ruled the Atlantic, and it was hard to get any ship across the Atlantic without having it bombed, for people were afraid to send their children on the ships. Instead, they took them down in the subways at night. And so we sent care packages, little packages with toothpaste and washcloths and soap and things that people would need. We were always busy wrapping up care packages to send either to England or to the people who were in the service.